Hey there, and welcome! Tonight, we're taking a journey back in time. Not to witness great battles or political intrigue, but to experience something much more humble and, frankly, much more boring. We're going to spend a completely ordinary day, in the life of a regular person in ancient Rome. No emperors, no gladiators, no dramatic events. Just the tedious, repetitive routine of daily existence in the largest city of the ancient world. Before you get too comfortable, let me set the scene. It's early morning in Rome, sometime around the year 115 CE, during the reign of the Emperor Trajan. The city is home to roughly 1 million people, making it by far the largest urban center in the Western world. But this isn't the Rome of marble temples and palatial estates you might imagine. This is the Rome of narrow streets, cramped apartments, and the endless daily grind of ordinary working people. Our protagonist for today is Marcus. Not Marcus Aurelius the Emperor, not some famous general or senator. Just Marcus, a man of about 30 years, who works as a clerk in a merchant's office near the Forum. Marcus is, in every way, unremarkable. And that's precisely why his day is so perfect for our purposes tonight. Because Marcus's day is boring. Wonderfully, peacefully, tediously boring. Let's begin as Marcus begins. In the pre-dawn darkness of his apartment, as the sounds of the city slowly coming to life filter through the thin walls of his insula. The first thing you need to understand about Marcus's living situation is that there's nothing romantic or comfortable about it. He lives on the 4th floor of a 6-story insula, an apartment building that rises precariously above a narrow street in the Subura district, one of the more crowded and less fashionable neighborhoods of Rome. His apartment consists of a single room, perhaps 12 feet by 15 feet, with one small window that faces the equally grimy building across the alley. The walls are thin enough that Marcus can hear his neighbors on both sides. The old widow next door who coughs through most of the night. The family with 3 young children on the other side, whose youngest seems to wake up, crying at least twice before dawn. Marcus owns very little furniture. There's his bed, which is really just a wooden frame, with rope supports and a thin mattress stuffed with straw and wool that he hasn't changed in over a year. There's a small wooden chest where he keeps his few possessions, 2 tunics, one for work and one slightly nicer one for social occasions. His writing materials, a few coins and some personal items, including a small bronze lamp and the household shrine to the Lares, the protective spirits of the home. In the corner stands a large ceramic storage jar that holds water, and beside it, a smaller vessel that serves a purpose we'll discuss shortly, though you can probably guess what that purpose is. The room is dark when Marcus first becomes aware of the world around him, not because he's jolted awake by anything dramatic, but because his body has simply decided, as bodies do, that sleep is over. It's that vague, undefined hour before dawn when the city is never truly silent, but not yet fully awake. He can hear the distant rumble of wagon wheels on stone streets. Wagons are only allowed in the city center during nighttime hours, so the sound of their wheels, and the occasional shout of a driver is one of the constants of the Roman night. From somewhere below comes the sound of a door opening and closing, probably the baker who lives on the ground floor heading out to start his ovens. Marcus doesn't leap out of bed. Why would he? There's no urgency yet. Instead, he lies there for a while, feeling the ache in his back from the thin mattress, aware of the cool morning air on his face while the rest of him is covered by a wool blanket that smells of wool, of sweat, of the general mustiness of a garment that's washed infrequently because washing is a laborious process he typically puts off as long as socially acceptable. He thinks about the day ahead, which will be much like yesterday and much like tomorrow. There are accounts to be copied. His employer, a merchant named Gaius Tullius who deals in olive oil and wine imported from Spain, keeps extensive records of transactions, shipments, and payments. Marcus's job is to maintain these records, copy them neatly onto fresh tablets, and occasionally draft letters on his employer's behalf. It's work that requires a neat hand and attention to detail, but it's not work that requires much creativity or ambition. It's work that pays enough to rent this single room, buy food, and occasionally afford some simple pleasures. It's work that fills the hours between waking and sleeping. It's boring work, which is to say it's typical work. Eventually, as the light outside his small window begins to shift from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn, Marcus sits up. His feet find the cold stone floor. There's no heat in this room except what comes from the buildings below, and in the early morning, even in summer, there's a chill. In winter, The cold is one of the defining features of life in an upper-floor insula apartment. But it's summer now, so the chill is actually somewhat pleasant after the stuffiness of sleeping under the wool blanket. He reaches for his tunic, which he'd draped over the end of his bed the night before. It's the same tunic he wore yesterday, and he'll wear it again today. The Romans do value cleanliness and fresh clothing among the wealthy classes, but Marcus is not wealthy. He owns 2 tunics, as I mentioned. One is for work, and that's the one he's pulling over his head now. It's made of undyed wool, a sort of grayish off-white that's supposed to be white but never quite gets there no matter how many times it's washed. The tunic is relatively simple, falling to just below his knees, belted at the waist with a cord. It's unremarkable, functional, and has a small stain near the hem from when he spilled wine at a tavern 3 weeks ago. The stain has become permanent, just another feature of the garment now. There's no elaborate dressing ritual. No choosing what to wear, no accessorizing, no checking himself in a mirror because he doesn't own a mirror beyond a small, polished bronze disc that gives only the vaguest impression of his appearance. He runs his fingers through his hair, which is getting longer than is fashionable, but not long enough to look deliberately unfashionable. He'll need to visit the barber soon, but that's a small expense he keeps putting off, telling himself he'll go next week, the same thing he told himself last week. Now comes one of the less pleasant necessities of the morning routine. Remember that smaller ceramic vessel I mentioned? Marcus picks it up and uses it for its intended purpose. In his building, as in most insulae, there's no private toilet. There's a chamber pot, and that's what this vessel is. He'll empty it later, either tossing the contents out his window into the street below, which is technically illegal but universally practiced, or carrying it down the 6 flights of stairs to dump in one of the public latrines. Given that it's early morning and he has to go downstairs anyway, he decides he'll carry it down. This decision is not motivated by civic responsibility, but by the fact that his window faces a relatively trafficked alley, and he'd rather not risk hitting someone who might then trace the trajectory back to his window. After setting the chamber pot aside to deal with later, Marcus runs his hands through his hair again, scratches his beard, which is short and currently itches. In that way beards do when they're in that awkward phase between freshly shaved and properly grown. He makes a mental note that yes, he really does need to visit the barber. Perhaps today after work if he has time and energy, though realistically he probably won't have energy, because he never seems to have energy after a full day at the merchant's office. He drinks some water from the large storage jar. The water that was hauled up 6 flights of stairs yesterday by the building's water carrier, a man who makes his living hauling water from the public fountains to the apartments of people who pay a small daily fee for the service. The water is tepid and has a slightly stale taste because it's been sitting in the clay jar, but it's water and it wets his dry morning mouth. Now Marcus picks up the chamber pot by its handle and opens the door to his room. The hallway is dark and narrow, and he has to navigate carefully because there are no windows out here. No source of light at all until you reach the stairwell. He knows this path by feel now, after living here for 3 years. Hand on the wall, he moves toward the stairs, passing the doors of his neighbors. From behind the door where the family with 3 children lives, he can already hear stirring, a child's sleepy complaint, a mother's hushed voice. The stairs are steep and narrow, worn smooth in the centers from countless feet over countless years. Marcus descends carefully, one hand on the wall, his other hand holding the chamber pot away from his body. The stairs turn at each landing, and at each landing, there are more doors, more apartments, more people living their own unremarkable lives. On the 3rd floor, he passes an elderly man who's heading upward, probably returning from the public fountain with a bucket of water. They nod to each other, a wordless acknowledgement of shared existence in this vertical village of apartments. By the time Marcus reaches the ground floor, the sky is perceptibly lighter, and through the building's entrance, he can see the street beginning to show signs of real activity. There's a cart passing by, its wheels creating that hollow rumbling sound on the paving stones. Someone is opening shutters in the shop across the street. The baker on the ground floor has his oven going now, and the smell of bread is just beginning to drift through the building. A smell that makes Marcus's stomach remind him that he hasn't eaten yet. He steps out into the street to make his way to the nearest public latrine, which is about 2 blocks away. The street is narrow, barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other, and it's lined with buildings that lean slightly inward at the top, as if they're tired and sagging from the weight of centuries. The paving stones beneath his feet are worn and uneven, And in the low spots, there are puddles from yesterday's rain, or possibly from other liquids he'd rather not identify. As he walks, Marcus keeps to one side of the street. Because you never know when someone above might be emptying their chamber pot, and while most people shout a warning, not everyone does. The morning air smells like a combination of things. Bread baking, yes, but also sewage from the open drains that run along the sides of the street, smoke from countless cooking fires and workshops, the particular smell of humanity living in close quarters, a smell that combines sweat and wool and cooking and waste and somehow just becomes the smell of the city itself, so familiar that Marcus doesn't really notice it anymore. Marcus walks with a measured, rhythmic pace. Each step on the worn basalt paving stones is familiar, a path he has trodden thousands of times. The air is still relatively cool, but the humidity of the Roman summer is already beginning to settle like a thin, damp veil. He reaches the public latrine at the corner of the block, a large, rectangular room built into the ground floor of a neighboring insula. As he enters, the air changes. It is thick with the sharp, acidic scent of ammonia and the damp smell of running water. There is no door to push open, only a heavy curtain that Marcus pushes aside. Inside, the space is surprisingly grand compared to his cramped room, though the grandeur is purely functional. Along the walls are long benches of cold white marble, punctuated by a series of keyhole-shaped openings. Marcus finds a spot among the dozen or so men already there. There are no stalls, no partitions, no illusions of privacy. He sits, his skin meeting the chilled surface of the marble, a sharp contrast to the warmth of his bed just moments ago. Beside him sits a man he recognizes from the local market, and across the room 2 others are engaged in a low, murmuring conversation about the price of grain. This is the Roman way. Even the most private of acts is a communal social event. Below his feet, a small channel of fresh water flows constantly through a shallow groove in the floor. Near the benches, in a deeper trough of salt water, sit the communal sponges, the xylospongium, sea sponges attached to long wooden sticks. Marcus reaches for one, the wood smooth and dark from years of use. There is no sense of disgust, only the quiet acceptance of a routine that has remained unchanged for centuries. He rinses the sponge in the flowing water, the sound of the stream providing a constant white noise backdrop to the low hum of morning voices. It is a slow, methodical process. There is no rushing in the latrine. It is a place where the city's frantic energy pauses for a few brief minutes. Once he has finished and emptied his chamber pot into the designated vat, Marcus steps back out into the light. The sun hasn't quite crested the rooftops of the Subura, but the sky is now a pale, dusty gold. His stomach gives a dull, insistent ache. Like the vast majority of Rome's 1 million inhabitants, Marcus has no hearth, no stove, and no way to cook in his single room. His kitchen is the street. He walks toward a small thermopolium, a fast food stall that sits on a busy intersection. The shop is open to the street, defined by a L-shaped marble counter with large ceramic jars, or dolia, embedded directly into the stone. These jars hold lentils, dried beans, and wine, but this morning, Marcus is looking for something simpler. The vendor, a man with thick arms and a face lined by years of standing over steam, nods at Marcus. No words are exchanged. They have done this every morning for years. Marcus reaches into the small pouch at his belt and produces a single copper as. In return, he is handed a small, round loaf of panis secundarius, a coarse, dark bread made of bran and lower quality flour. It is hard, the crust dusted with ash from the oven, but it is substantial. For a few extra coins, the vendor adds a small handful of wrinkled black olives and a sliver of salty, sheep's milk cheese, translucent and white. Marcus moves away from the counter, finding a spot to lean against a stone pillar near a fountain. He breaks the bread. It doesn't tear so much as snap. He eats slowly, systematically, pairing each bite of the dry, nutty bread with the saltiness of an olive or the sharp tang of the cheese. He isn't looking for a culinary experience. He is simply fueling the machine of his body for the hours of writing ahead. He watches the city stir. A group of schoolboys walks past, followed by a slave carrying their wax tablets. A water seller cries out his price. Marcus finishes the last crust, wipes his hands on his tunic, and feels the familiar, heavy weight of the day truly beginning. He makes the climb back up the 6 flights of stairs to his room, a slow ascent that leaves his calves burning slightly. He enters his room one last time to gather the tools of his trade. From the wooden chest, he retrieves his polyptychon, a set of several wooden tablets, joined by leather thongs, their inner surfaces coated in dark, smooth beeswax. Beside them, he places his bronze stylus, pointed at one end for etching letters, into the wax and flat at the other for smoothing mistakes away. He also takes a small bundle of papyrus scrolls, yellowed and fragile, and a small ceramic inkwell. These are his world. With his materials tucked under his arm, Marcus closes his door and slides the simple bolt home. He begins the long walk toward the Forum, leaving the shadowed alleys of the Subura behind as he moves toward the heart of the empire. Just another gray figure in the waking tide of Rome. Marcus steps out of the heavy shadows of his apartment, building and into the awakening arteries of the Subura. To a traveler, this would be a sensory assault, a chaotic, pulsing labyrinth, but to Marcus, it is merely a series of obstacles to be navigated. He does not see the grandeur of Rome. He sees the uneven paving stone at the corner of the argoletum that always trips the unwary, and the specific shop awning that drips cold, condensation onto your shoulder if you walk too close to the left. The street is now a river of humanity. It is the hour of the salutatio, when hundreds of clients, dressed in their formal but often threadbare white togas, scurry through the mud to the houses of their wealthy patrons, hoping for a handout or a favor. Marcus, in his simple, work-stained tunic, moves against this tide. He is a ghost among the ambitious, a man with no patron to flatter and no favors to ask, save for the continued steady boredom of his employment. He passes the same shopkeepers he has seen every day for 3 years. There is the dyer, his hands permanently stained a deep, bruised purple, already hanging wet wool over a line that stretches across the alley. The smell is pungent, a mixture of stale urine used as a fixative and the heavy, wet scent of sheep. Marcus doesn't wrinkle his nose. He simply breathes through his mouth until he is 10 paces past, a reflex developed over 1,000 mornings. Further down, the street narrows even more as vendors begin to encroach upon the public space. A man selling hot chickpeas shouts his price, his voice already rasping. A vegetable seller is meticulously stacking cabbages into a pyramid, a small feudal act of order in a city of chaos. Marcus maneuvers around a mule-drawn cart that has become wedged against a stone post. The driver is screaming obscenities that Marcus has heard since childhood, words that have lost their edge and become a kind of urban background music, no more significant than the chirping of birds in the countryside. He passes the Temple of Peace, a massive structure that should inspire awe, but to Marcus, it is merely a landmark that signifies he is halfway to the office. He doesn't look up at the soaring columns or the intricate friezes. Instead, he watches his feet, avoiding the fresh dung of the mule and the slick, mossy patches where the street fountains have overflowed. He sees the same beggar near the entrance to the Forum, a man with a missing leg and a rhythmic, melodic plea for a single quadrans. Marcus has never given him a coin, not out of cruelty, but out of a shared understanding of the city's indifference. They acknowledge each other with a flicker of the eyes, two fixtures of the same street, as permanent and unremarkable as the stones themselves. As he nears the Forum Romanum, the architecture shifts. The cramped, leaning insulae of the Subura give way to the sprawling, marble-clad government buildings and the great basilicas. The air feels slightly more open here, but the noise increases. This is the heart of the world, yet for Marcus, it is simply his workplace. The gleaming white marble reflects the morning sun, forcing him to squint, a dull ache beginning behind his eyes that he knows will stay with him until sunset. He turns off the main square into a smaller, secondary street lined with the offices of bankers, shippers, and merchants. He stops before a modest 2-story stone building. This is the headquarters of Gaius Tullius. There is no grand sign, only a small bronze plaque beside the heavy oak door. Marcus pushes the door open. The air inside is cooler, smelling of old parchment, cedarwood, and the faint, lingering scent of the olive oil samples kept in the back. In the main room, 3 other clerks are already at their stations. There is Quintus, an older man whose fingers are permanently bent from 40 years of gripping a stylus, and Lucius, a younger, restless man who is constantly looking toward the door, dreaming of a life beyond the ledger. Marcus, Quintus says, not looking up from his wax tablet. Quintus, Marcus replies. It is the extent of their morning interaction. No questions about health, no talk of dreams. They are like parts of a clock, clicking into place as the gears begin to turn. Marcus moves to his designated stool, a hard, backless wooden seat that has been smoothed by his own weight over the years. He lays out his tablets, his stylus, and his inkwell. The room is quiet, save for the scratching of wood on wax and the distant, muffled roar of the city outside. For Marcus, the world has narrowed down to the size of a wooden frame, and the meticulous, Repetitive task of recording how many amphorae of wine arrived from Hispania on the ship. Neptune's grace. The sun climbs higher outside, but in here, in the dim, steady light of the merchant's office, time begins to stretch and flatten. The day has truly begun. It is a day of silence, of ink, and of the wonderful heavy weight of the ordinary. Marcus takes his seat. A practiced motion that ends with the familiar creak of the wooden stool. He arranges his tools with a precision born not of passion, but of necessity. If the inkwell is too far to the right, he wastes a fraction of a second with every dip. If the tablets are misaligned, the light from the high, narrow window casts a shadow over his own hand. In the world of a clerk, efficiency is the only defense against the crushing weight of the hours. He picks up his stylus. It is a simple tool, a slender rod of bronze, cold and heavy in his grip. The pointed end is sharp enough to bite into the dark. Honey-scented beeswax that fills the recessed center of his wooden tablets. He begins with a shipment of olive oil from the Baetica province of Spain. Septuaginta amphorae olei, 70 amphorae of oil. The physical act of writing in Rome is not the fluid, effortless glide of a modern pen. It is a craft of pressure and resistance. Marcus must press down with just enough force to leave a clear, legible mark in the wax, but not so hard that he scrapes the wood beneath. He forms each letter in the rustic capital script. The A with its slanted bar, the S a jagged snake, the V a sharp valley. The stylus makes a faint, rhythmic sound against the wax, a soft scritch, scritch, scritch that becomes the heartbeat of the room. As he moves from the first tablet to the second, the repetitive nature of the task begins to work its strange magic. His mind drifts, yet his hand continues its work. This is the clerk's trance. He is no longer thinking about the oil or the merchant or the price of grain. He is merely a conduit for data, a living bridge between one piece of information and another. The office is a sanctuary of quietude. To his left, Quintus is working on a papyrus scroll. The scratch of his reed pen, the calamus, sharper and more frantic than Marcus's stylus. Every so often, the sound of a small ceramic jar being tapped against a table breaks the silence as someone settles the sediment in their ink. These are the only markers of time. There are no clocks here, no ticking hands to measure the progress of the morning. Instead, there is only the shifting geometry of the sunlight. When Marcus first sat down, the sun was a narrow sliver of gold high on the eastern wall. Now it has descended, broadening into a bright, rectangular patch that crawls slowly across the floorboards. He watches a single dust mote dance in the beam, rising and falling on a draft he cannot feel. It is a slow, hypnotic journey. By the time that patch of light reaches the edge of his desk, 2 hours will have passed. He calculates his life in these golden increments. The ache begins in his thumb first, a dull, throbbing pressure where the bronze rod rests against the joint. Then it spreads to his wrist, a stiffness that comes from the hundreds of tiny, precise movements required to keep his lines straight. He pauses for a moment, setting the stylus down. He stretches his fingers, pulling them back until the knuckles crack, a sound that seems unnaturally loud in the hushed room. Lucius, the younger clerk, glances up for a split second, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared, weary recognition before they both return to their tasks. The air in the office begins to warm. The cool crispness of the dawn has evaporated, replaced by a stagnant, heavy heat. The smell of the beeswax becomes more pronounced as it softens slightly. In the rising temperature, making the writing easier but the smudge risk higher. Marcus has to be careful now. One stray movement of his palm could erase an entire line of figures, forcing him to use the flat, spatula end of his stylus to smooth the wax and start again. The thought of having to redo work is the only thing that keeps his focus sharp. Around the 4th hour of the day, what we would call mid-morning, Marcus becomes aware of a new sensation. It is a faint, hollow drumming in his midsection. The bread and olives he ate at dawn are long gone, burned up by the mental strain of the ledgers. His mind begins to conjure images of the midday meal. Nothing extravagant, perhaps a bowl of cold lentil stew or a piece of saltfish from the vendor across the street. He finds himself staring at the word codex for a few seconds too long, his eyes losing focus. He shakes his head slightly and dips his pen. To succumb to the hunger is to make the time go slower. The secret to enduring the Roman workday is to stay submerged in the tedium, to let the rhythm of the letters carry you like a slow-moving river. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He records the sale of 300 hides to a local tanner. He records the payment of a debt by a tavern keeper in the Velabrum. He records the loss of 2 jars of wine that broke during transit near the docks of Ostia. Each entry is a tiny fragment of a vast humming empire, and Marcus is the one tasked with ensuring it is all remembered. The sunlight has now reached his lap, warming the wool of his tunic. He feels a bead of sweat trickle down his temple, but he doesn't wipe it away. He is nearly at the end of the first ledger. Only 3 more tablets to go before the midday break. He adjusts his grip, ignores the cramp in his forearm, and presses the point of the bronze back into the dark, waiting wax. The morning is long. The work is endless. And for Marcus, in this moment, that is exactly as it should be. The bells of a distant temple do not ring to signal the hour. But Marcus knows the time by the weight of the air. The sun has reached its zenith, hanging directly above the narrow canyon of the street, turning the strips of sky between the rooftops into a blinding, searing white. Inside the office, the light has lost its golden hue and become a flat, unforgiving glare. Quintus is the first to stop. He lays his reed pen down with a decisive click and sighs, a long, rattling sound that seems to deflate his entire chest. Marcus follows suit. He sets his bronze stylus in the groove of his desk and slowly uncurls his right hand. His fingers have stiffened into a claw-like shape, the ghost of the stylus still lingering in his muscles. He rubs his palm against his thigh, feeling the pins and needles of returning circulation. There is a profound, albeit quiet, relief in this moment, the simple act of not writing. "The heat is heavy today," Lucius mutters, wiping a sheen of oil and sweat from his forehead. Marcus merely nods. He doesn't have the energy for a debate on the weather. He stands, his knees popping like dry twigs, and feels the blood rush back into his legs. For 6 hours, he has been a stationary object. Now, he must become a person again, if only for an hour. He steps out of the office and is immediately hit by the wall of midday heat. In Rome, the 6th hour, the sexta, is a time of strange suspension. The frantic morning energy has burned off, replaced by a heavy lethargic stillness. Many of the wealthier citizens have retreated to their shaded courtyards for a siesta. But for Marcus and the thousands of workers like him, the day is only half conquered. He walks a short distance to a thermopolium he frequents. It is crowded, the air thick with the smell of scorched herbs, boiled cabbage, and the sharp, fermented tang of garum, the ubiquitous Roman fish sauce. Men stand shoulder to shoulder around the L-shaped marble counter, their tunics damp, their faces flushed. Marcus waits his turn, watching the steam rise from the deep ceramic jars embedded in the counter. When he reaches the front, he points to a dish of salted, dried fish and a scoop of thick lentil porridge. He pays his few copper coins, the metal warm from being held in his hand. The food is served in a simple earthenware bowl. He takes a piece of bread, softer than his breakfast loaf, and uses it to scoop up the porridge. The lentils are earthy and heavy, seasoned with cumin and a generous splash of garum that provides a hit of salt and umami, cutting through the blandness of the grain. The fish is chewy and intensely salty, making his mouth water. He eats standing up, leaning his back against a stone wall just outside the shop. Beside him, Lucius is eating a piece of flatbread topped with leeks. "Old Tullius is in a foul mood today," Lucius says between bites. He thinks the shipment from Gades is late because of the storms. "He'll have us recalculating the insurance risks by evening." Marcus chews slowly, savoring the salt on his tongue. "Then we will recalculate," he says simply. He doesn't want to think about insurance risks or the storms in the Mediterranean. He wants to focus on the texture of the lentils and the way the shade of the building feels on his skin. He looks at the street. A stray dog is sleeping in a patch of dust, its ribs rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic pant. A group of laborers are sitting on the steps of a nearby shrine, sharing a jug of watered-down wine, their voices low and drowsy. This is the heartbeat of the empire, not the speeches in the Senate or the triumph of the generals, but this collective, exhausted pause in the heat of the day. Marcus finishes his meal and uses a final crust of bread to wipe the bowl clean. He feels a profound sense of lethargy beginning to settle over him. The midday slump. His body wants nothing more than to curl up in a cool, dark corner and sleep for 3 hours. But the awareness of the unfinished ledgers sits in the back of his mind like a heavy stone. He watches the shadows. They have begun their slow, inevitable shift toward the west. The break is ending. The temporary freedom of the street is over. He turns back toward the office door, the cool interior now looking less like a sanctuary and more like a cell. He stretches his back one last time, breathes in the dusty hot air of the forum, and steps back inside to reclaim his stool. The stylus is waiting. The wax is still there, blank and expectant. The second half of the day, identical to the first, begins now. The stool feels harder now. As Marcus sits back down, the wooden surface seems to have lost whatever meager comfort it held in the morning. The transition from the bright, searing heat of the street to the dim interior of the office is jarring, leaving purple ghosts dancing in his vision. He blinks, waiting for his eyes to adjust to the familiar shadows of the merchant's house. The light has changed. It is no longer the sharp, vertical glare of noon. It has become a heavy, honey-colored weight that slants through the high windows, illuminating billions of dust motes that hang suspended in the stagnant air. The room is hotter now than it was in the morning. The stone walls, which provided a brief coolness at dawn, have spent all day absorbing the Roman sun and are now radiating that heat back into the room. Marcus picks up his stylus. It feels heavier, the bronze warmed by the air. He begins the afternoon's task. A ledger of spice imports, pepper from the Far East, long shriveled and precious, and cinnamon bark that smells of sun-baked earth. He writes, Piperis longi libre viginti. 20 pounds of long pepper. The work is even more repetitive now. In the morning there was a certain rhythm, a freshness to the effort. Now there is only the grind. His hand moves with a mechanical dullness. The muscles in his forearm are tight, a constant low-grade ache that hums from his elbow down to his fingertips. Every few minutes he has to stop and consciously relax his grip, stretching his hand out wide until the skin across his knuckles feels thin and taut. Time begins to behave strangely. In the morning, hours were marked by the progress of the light across the floor. Now time seems to stretch and thin, like gold leaf being hammered until it is nearly transparent. He looks at a single line of text and feels as though he's been staring at it for a lifetime. The scratching of the other clerk's pen sounds distant, like insects burrowing into dry wood. Around the 8th hour, Gaius Tullius the merchant walks through the room. He is a man of substance, his toga made of fine bleached wool that rustles as he moves. He stops behind Marcus, the scent of expensive wine and expensive soap momentarily, cutting through the smell of hot wax. The figures for the Sabinus account, Tullius says, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Ensure the interest is calculated at the city rate, not the maritime rate. I'll not lose coins to a clerk's oversight. Yes, Dominus, Marcus replies, not turning his head. It is a brief, hollow interaction. Tullius does not see Marcus. He sees a tool, a biological extension of the stylus. When the merchant leaves, the silence that settles back over the room feels even heavier than before. Marcus returns to the Sabinus account. His mind is foggy, the heat and the salt from lunch creating a dry, persistent thirst. He reaches for his water jar, takes a sip of the now warm clay-tasting water, and turns back to his tablet. He begins to etch a series of numbers, the interest on 40 amphorae of Falernian wine. Suddenly he stops. His heart gives a small, tired thud. He has written XCV instead of XCVI. A simple error. A tiny slip of the hand. But in the world of the ledger, it is a disaster of geometry. He sighs, a sound of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. He turns his stylus around using the flat broad end, the spatula. He holds it over the mistake, the heat of the room making the wax just soft enough to work. With a slow, steady pressure, he begins to smooth the wax over, erasing the incorrect letters. It is a tedious process. He must be careful not to create a hollow in the wax or to smudge the lines above and below. He rubs the wax until the surface is once again dark and smooth. A blank slate of failure. He has to wait a moment for the wax to firm up again, before he can re-etch the correct figures. This small detour, this 5 minutes of wasted effort, feels like a monumental burden. It is the weight of having to do the same thing twice in a life, already defined by doing the same thing forever. The sun is lower now, turning the air in the office into a thick, reddish haze. The shadows of the desk stretch out like long, dark fingers reaching for the far wall. Marcus's neck is stiff. A sharp pain has settled between his shoulder blades, a result of hours spent hunched over the low table. He shifts his weight, trying to find a position that doesn't ache, but there is none. He watches a fly land on the edge of his inkwell. It cleans its wings with agonizing slowness. Marcus finds himself envying the fly, its lack of ledgers, its lack of interest rates, its simple, sun-drenched existence. He looks back at his tablet. The light is fading, making it harder to see the faint marks in the wax. He has to lean closer, his nose inches from the honey-scented surface. The day is ending, but it is ending with a glacial slowness. Every line he completes feels like a mile walked in heavy sand. He isn't working for the merchant anymore. He is working for the sunset. He is working for the moment he can lay down the bronze and walk back into the cooling, purple twilight of the city. The light in the office has finally surrendered. It is no longer a golden weight, but a soft, dusty violet that fills the corners and makes the text on the papyrus look like rows of silent ghosts. The scratching of pens has slowed, then stopped. There is no bell to signal the end, only the shared unspoken realization among the clerks that the eyes can no longer distinguish between a 3 and a 3. Marcus lays his stylus down for the final time today. The bronze is warm, almost feverish from the friction of his grip. He feels a strange, hollow sensation in his palm where the tool has rested for nearly 10 hours. He picks up the flat spatula and does one final pass over his tablets, smoothing out the minor irregularities of the wax, preparing the surface for tomorrow's tedium. He stacks the tablets carefully, ties them with the leather thong, and places them back into his wooden chest. Until tomorrow, Marcus, Lucius says, his voice sounding thin and distant. Tomorrow, Marcus replies. It is a promise and a sentence all at once. He steps out into the Roman evening. The city has undergone a transformation. The fierce, aggressive heat of the afternoon has been replaced by a cooling breeze that rolls off the Tiber, carrying with it the smell of the sea and the damp earth. The streets are no longer filled with the frantic rush of morning business. Instead, there's a low humming energy. People are moving toward the baths, toward the taverns, or toward their cramped homes. Marcus pauses at the intersection. To his left lies the great baths, the thermae. He can hear the distant splash of water and the rhythmic thumping of athletes in the palaestra. He imagines the heat of the caldarium, the thick steam that opens the pores and melts the ache from the shoulders. He imagines the slave rubbing him with olive oil, and then the sharp, scraping sensation of the strigil. The curved metal tool used to whisk away the sweat, oil, and the grime of the office. But today, the walk to the baths feels like a mountain he cannot climb. His legs are heavy, and the thought of navigating the crowds of the locker rooms is more than he can bear. He chooses instead to head toward the Subura. He stops at a small, familiar tavern, a papina, near the entrance to his district. It is a dim, smoky place, the walls stained with soot, from the lamps and decorated with crude paintings of wine jars and gladiators. He doesn't sit at the communal tables in the center. He finds a small stool in a corner, tucked behind a stone pillar. A cup of the red, he says to the girl behind the counter. Watered well. She brings him a ceramic cup of cheap vinegary wine, diluted with enough water to make it refreshing rather than intoxicating. He sips it slowly. The cold liquid hits the back of his dry throat, and for the first time since dawn, he feels the tension in his jaw begin to release. He watches the other patrons, 2 soldiers arguing over a game of dice, a group of weavers laughing too loudly, a lone woman staring into the bottom of her cup. He is among them, yet entirely separate. He is merely an observer of the evening, a man who has traded his day for a handful of copper coins. When the wine is gone, he stops at a vendor's stall and buys a small wedge of hard cheese and a few dried figs. This will be his dinner, eaten in the silence of his room. The climb up the 6 flights of stairs to his apartment is a slow, agonizing ritual. Each step is a conscious effort. The hallway of the insula is dark now, lit only by the faint, flickering light of a few oil lamps placed near the landings. He reaches his door, slides the bolt, and enters. The room is exactly as he left it, though the air is stale and warm. He doesn't light his bronze lamp. There is no need. The moonlight through the small window provides enough silver light to guide him. He sits on the edge of his bed, his feet finding the familiar cold stone floor. He unties the cord of his tunic and pulls the garment over his head. Feeling the cool air on his damp skin, he lies back on the straw mattress. It creaks under his weight, the familiar scent of old wool and sweat rising to greet him. The sounds of the Subura filter through the walls, a distant shout, the rumble of a nighttime wagon, the rhythmic coughing of the widow next door. Marcus closes his eyes. He thinks of the ledgers, the olive oil, the pepper, and the interest rates. They are gone now, dissolved into the purple shadows of the room. Tomorrow will be exactly like today. The same walk, the same stylus, the same lentils, the same stairs. And in that certainty, there is a strange, profound peace. As the great city of Rome continues to roar outside his window, Marcus drifts into the deep, heavy sleep of the unremarkable. The twilight has deepened into a bruised indigo. As Marcus begins the ascent to his fourth-floor room, the staircase of the insula feels longer than it did at dawn. The wood of the steps, worn smooth by generations of tired feet, groans under his weight. On the second floor, the smell of fried fish lingers in the air. On the third, the sound of a heated argument between a husband and wife, muffled by a thick timber door. These are the markers of his vertical village, the intimate, messy sounds of 1,000 lives stacked one on top of the other. He reaches his door. The iron key feels heavy, the lock stiff. As he steps inside, the silence of his room rushes to meet him. It is a small space, but in the encroaching dark it feels vast and empty. Marcus moves to the small wooden chest. With practiced fingers, he finds his bronze oil lamp, a simple leaf-shaped vessel. He strikes a spark from a flint, a tiny sharp crack in the quiet, and coaxes a flame onto the linen wick. The light is small and orange, casting long, dancing shadows of his bed and water jar against the lime-washed walls. The flame flickers in the draft from the window, making the room seem to breathe. He sits on the edge of his bed and unwraps the dinner he bought, the wedge of salty sheep's cheese and the dark wrinkled figs. He eats slowly, the chewiness of the fruit and the sharp crumble of the cheese providing a tactile reality that the abstract numbers of the ledger lacked. He doesn't think about the merchant Tullius or the price of grain. He thinks about the texture of the food. He thinks about the way the light glints off the bronze lamp. He thinks about the quiet. After he finishes, he reaches into his chest and pulls out a single small piece of scrap papyrus, a discarded margin from the office, and his reed pen. He dips it into the small inkwell. He begins to write a few lines to his brother, who lives on a small farm near Tibur. "The summer heat is here," he writes, his hand moving slower than it did at the office, the letters less precise, more human. "The city is loud, but the work is steady. I hope the olives are ripening well." He doesn't say that he is tired. He doesn't say that the walls of the Subura feel as though they are leaning in a little closer every year. Such things are not written. He rolls the papyrus, ties it with a bit of string, and sets it aside to be given to a messenger at the forum tomorrow. The act of writing for himself, even just those few words, feels like a reclamation of his soul. Outside, the character of the city's noise has shifted. The daytime roar of voices and footsteps has been replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the night. Because wagons are forbidden in the city during the day, the night belongs to the wheels. He hears the distant, hollow clack, clack, clack of iron-rimmed wheels on stone, a sound that vibrates through the very foundations of the building. Somewhere below, a door slams. A dog barks once, twice, then falls silent. Marcus stands and walks to the window. From the fourth floor, he cannot see the grand temples of the forum, only the crooked rooflines of the neighboring buildings, and a narrow strip of sky where the stars are, struggling against the haze of a million cooking fires. The air smells of wood smoke and old stone. He turns back to the room. He reaches out and pinches the wick of the lamp. The flame dies with a tiny hiss, and a thin trail of white, smoke that smells of olive oil. The darkness that follows is not absolute. It is a soft, grainy gray, illuminated by the moonlight reflecting off the building across the alley. He pulls his tunic over his head and drapes it over the wooden chest. He stands for a moment in the cool air, his skin prickling before climbing onto the mattress. The straw rustles and sighs, settling around his body. He pulls the heavy wool blanket up to his chin. It is coarse and smells faintly of the day's sweat, but it is warm and it is his. The exhaustion finally takes hold. It is not the sharp, burning fatigue of a soldier or a stonecutter, but a heavy, liquid tiredness that fills his limbs like lead. His mind, which spent 10 hours tethered to the precise lines of the ledger, finally begins to unspool. The numbers blur into shapes. The shapes blur into the sound of the wind. He listens to the widow coughing next door. He listens to the distant shout of a wagon driver. He listens to the heartbeat of Rome, a city that never truly sleeps, even as it grants Marcus this brief gray sanctuary. His breathing slows. His grip on the blanket relaxes. The room, the building, and the great stone city around him fade into a single dark hum. Marcus is no longer a clerk, no longer a Roman, no longer a name in a ledger. He is simply a man, drifting into the deep, shoreless sea of sleep. The room is now fully surrendered to the night. As Marcus breathes in the cool, still air of his apartment, we can take a moment to step back, away from his bed, away from the Subura, and away from the year 115. We look at this life not as a singular event, but as a single stitch in a vast, endless tapestry. The life of Marcus is defined by its repetition. Tomorrow the sun will strike the same high window at the same angle. He will feel the same chill on the floor, hear the same baker opening his shop below, and navigate the same river of white togas in the forum. To our modern ears, this might sound like a burden, but for Marcus, and for millions like him throughout the centuries, there is a profound, quiet safety in the predictable. History is often taught through the lens of the spectacular, the falling of kings, the burning of cities, and the speeches of the great. But the true heartbeat of the human story is found in the ordinary. It is found in the millions of hands that held styluses, the millions of feet that climbed 6 flights of stairs, and the millions of eyes that watched the light fade across a stone wall. As the seasons turn, Marcus's routine remains the essential anchor of his existence. In the winter, he will wake in a room so cold his breath mists in the lamplight, and he will wrap himself in 2 wool tunics instead of 1. In the spring, the air in the merchant's office will carry the scent of rain and blooming jasmine from the gardens on the Palatine Hill, but the ledger will still be there. The wax will still wait for his stylus. There is a strange meditative beauty in this sameness. It is the rhythm of the tides. It is the rising and setting of the sun. It is the understanding that one's work, however small, however tedious, is a necessary part of a much larger world. The sounds of Rome outside the window are beginning to thin. Even the wagons are fewer now as the middle of the night approaches. The city is breathing in a deep, slow cadence. If you are still awake, listening to the soft echoes of this ancient day, let the image of the office fade. Let the smell of the ink and the taste of the salt olives drift away. Think instead of the silence that exists between the stars. Think of the way a single candle flame looks just before it is extinguished. The story of Marcus is a story of rest. It is a reminder that no matter how long the day, no matter how many lines of text must be copied, there is always the return to the dark. There is always the blanket. There is always the stillness. Most of history was lived in this quiet way. Not in the roar of the Colosseum, but in the soft scratching of a pen. Not in the triumph of a general, but in the simple satisfaction of a meal after a long day. We are all in some way part of this long line of people seeking the same thing, a steady life, a familiar path, and a place to lay our heads when the light fails. Marcus is deep in sleep now. His dreams are not of empires or gold. They are likely fragments of the day. The ripple of water in a fountain, the texture of a piece of bread, the silver light on his floor. He is at rest. The world is at rest. The city of Rome continues its slow, nocturnal spin. The stone buildings hold the heat of the day, releasing it slowly into the night air. The gods in their temples watch over the sleeping millions. Everything is as it should be. Everything is in its place. Rest now, as Marcus rests. Let your thoughts become as thin as the moonlight. Let the weight of your own day settle into the earth. There is nothing more to do. There is nothing more to hear. Only the silence. Only the breath. Only the deep, peaceful dark.